10% of $455 equals $45.50. But I only have $46 in cash. I wonder if I could take my change out of the basket.
God, you've been so good to me. Thank you for your provision in my life.
Where does all this money go? Shouldn't the pastors know that we need softer toilet paper in the bathroom? I think that instead of giving money this week, I'll buy the toilet paper that I like and give it to the church.
Lord, you know my needs. I give this in faith. Please cover my debts and make my car last a long time.
Since I sent my money to that television evangelist this week, I'll count that as my tithe.
Mom gave me $1 and I get to put it in. Why do we do that anyway?
As soon as I get out of debt, I'll start tithing.
10%? Where does that come from? What happens if I only give 5%? No, wait, that's too hard.
God, I know you see how much money I give. I hope these pastors appreciate it.
Okay, God, you know.
Well, welcome back to Debate Night after that brief break. Again, here to reintroduce the topic. Again, does Islam violate basic human rights? We now are going into our crossfire portion of our program, and we'll give 2 minutes at this point to Sami Zadari. Sam, you have 2 minutes. You can go ahead and start with this crossfire portion.
Okay, first of all, you're saying I'm being inconsistent. When you defined human rights according to God, that's what you said. So I'm holding your God accountable to human rights as well, and then you say I'm being inconsistent. No, it seems you want to make the rules as you go along, and when the rules go against you, you say I'm being inconsistent. But thank you for admitting the Old Testament. Yeah, of course it has slavery. So yeah, of course the Old Testament goes against basic human rights. You can't have your cake and eat it. Then you bring up the Meccan verse are abrogated by the Quran, by the Medina verses. Can you show me a single verse in the Quran that says those verses have been abrogated specifically? Furthermore, I quoted you Surah 5, verse 99, which says that the duty of the Prophet is to only convey the message. And guess what? That was revealed in Medina, which you are ignorant of because you don't know these things. You keep relying on this silly explanation that Meccan verses are all abrogated by Medina verses. Now, indeed, there are some scholars who say that some verses from Mecca have been abrogated, but as I'm aware, I don't believe there's a scholar who says that all the verses have been abrogated. Furthermore, there are Islamic scholars who say they have not been abrogated. So please, Tony, don't cherry pick which scholars you want and which scholars you don't want. Now, if we have a scholarly dispute, we need to go to the text. So far, you haven't gone to the text to show that those verses have been abrogated. If you're simply relying on a few scholars, then that is a very poor way of debating. Now, why don't I quote you some scholars on apostasy? Why don't I quote you some prominent scholars, such as Sheikh Taha Jabir al-Awani, a former...
Okay, 2 minutes is up. Your 2 minutes is up. Okay, Tony, you have 2 minutes, and you can go right now.
In response to what Sammy was saying, the problem here is not mine with the principle of abrogation. I'm simply quoting what Muslims, scholars and theologians and jurists have been saying about these passages. Now, the passage that Sammy had quoted from Surah 2 about there being no compulsion in religion, this is recognized as not applicable to Muslims. Now, the Quran doesn't tell me that. I'm simply quoting what your commentators have said on the subject, and so I'm going on what the Islamic sources tell me. Now, again, when you appeal to the Old Testament and you say that the Old Testament is God is being consistent, not at all. God does change his methodology. God himself is immutable. But the way God administers his laws and his ways in the Old Testament are not the same as the New Testament, and we would not expect him to be so. And so the New Testament is the new covenant that God has entered into with his people. And of course, they're going to be based on different principles than we find in the Old Testament. So again, the debate tonight, Sammy, is not on the Bible and human rights. It's on Islam on human rights. And you still have not defined what human rights are. What do you believe, Sammy, are basic human rights in Islam? Can you define what are basic human rights? You affirm that Islam does not deny them. If Islam does not deny them, then define them for us. What exactly are human rights?
Okay. All right. Okay, so now we will go ahead into another 2 minutes for Sammy. We're going to reset the clock, and you can start right now.
Okay, so notice what Tony said. He's just quoting scholars. He basically has nothing from the Quranic text. He's just relying on what a few scholars said. I'm sorry, that's a poor form of debating, because I can quote you other scholars who say otherwise. In fact, you're committing a fallacy of simply appealing to authority. I can play the same game with Christianity. I can bring up so many classical Christian scholars who said, yes, you can make war, you can kill apostates, and you would reject that. But yet you want to hold me to this inconsistent standard that I have to go by what any scholar says. I'm going to repeat the challenge, Tony. Bring me a single verse from the Quran or the Hadiths that says those verses have been abrogated. And again, I quoted you a verse from Medina, which basically refutes your own statement. So that argument has been debunked. You must show me a verse. And now let me quote you some scholars on Islamic apostasy, because you claimed you've quoted all these big scholars. Well, how about I quote scholars? In fact, before I quote a scholar, why don't I quote you a hadith from Bukhari? Tony, do you know there was an incident once when a man pledged allegiance to Islam, and then the next day he took that allegiance back? He left Islam right in front of the Prophet Muhammad's face, and the Prophet Muhammad let him go. This is from the hadith, not a scholar. Now I challenge you to respond to that. And let me quote you other scholars: Ibrahim al-Nakhai, Abu al-Walid al-Baji. These are top scholars. So let's not play what one scholar said or what one other scholar said. When there's a dispute, we go to the text. And obviously, you don't want to go to the text because you can't show any text that says what you are saying. And does Islam violate basic human rights? No, it doesn't.
Okay,
it grants
2 minutes. 2 minutes are up, Sammy. Okay, we have one final 2-minute segment for Reverend Tony Costa, and we will start that right now.
Well, you have just heard Sammy say that Islam does not violate basic human rights. He still hasn't defined what human rights are in order to affirm that Islam does keep them. Now, again, any cursory reading of any Islamic authorities. Now, Sammy is saying, well, I'm committing the fallacy of appealing to authority, but certainly that is a fallacious charge. The whole concept of isnad, the whole concept of the chain of narration in the hadith is all based on appeal to authority. What is the hadith about? But if not, appeal to authority, justification for various practices, postures in prayer. And so what I'm simply doing is I'm simply appealing to people like Maududi, who was considered one of the greatest Islamic minds, theologians of the 20th century. And Maududi tells us that Surah 2 and verse 256 does not apply to Muslims. It is a Meccan verse, and in the context, let's go to the passage, Sammy. In the context of Surah 2, Muhammad is addressing the Meccans, and he is telling them that there is no compulsion in religion. He says to them, to you be your religion, and to us be our religion. But notice in the Medinan surahs, the tone changes. The Medinan surah says that no religion will be accepted but Islam. The Medinan surahs are very clear that you're not to make friends with the Jews and the Christians. The Medinan surahs are very clear in Surah 9 that you are to fight against those who believe not. And so it seems very clear to me. And again, I'm not appealing to just any authority. I'm appealing to the Islamic theologians, those who are considered the theologians and scholars of Islamic theology. And so I don't think I'm doing anything that is out of line with any appeal to authority within Islam itself. And so again, we'd like to hear if Sammy can define for us what exactly is human rights.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Reverend Costa, and thank you, Sammy. Now, at this point, each of you will have 5 minutes to provide your closing statement. We'll start with Sammy Zatari, and then we'll go to Reverend Tony Costa. And some of you know that have been calling in, and you're in line for our calls. So we just want to encourage others that haven't done so, if they would like to do that, get ready to do that. You can start making the calls at 248-416-1300 and getting in line and getting ready to get your question on the air. And we'll just remind everybody it's one question per person, and we'll just need to know your name and also who you're directing the question to. But before we get to that, we have 5 minutes for the closing statement for Sammy Zatari. You can go ahead right now, Sammy.
Okay, thank you. So basically, I have to repeat myself for the third time or fourth time, I'm not sure. Tony, I brought you a verse from Medina which talks about religious tolerance, where God told the Prophet Muhammad, you're only commanded to give the message, not force them into it. And you have not even touched that verse once. So stop pretending that all Medina verses say something else when I've brought this verse up 3 times, maybe 4. And you bring up an excellent point. You can just quote scholars. You're quoting who? Madudi, that's all you have? You can't quote the text? First of all, you need to learn basics of Islamic theology and Islamic law jurisprudence. Because according to Islam, if one scholar says something, you don't have to take it. You have to take it if the evidence is strong. So when you say, I'm just quoting these scholars, which you haven't named, by the way, you've only named one. When you say you're quoting these scholars, no Muslim is required to blindly take what they say unless the evidence backs them up. And I'm asking you for the 3rd or 4th time, show me the Islamic text. And this is how Muslims do things. According to our religion, show the text that says Surah 2 and all those verses which talk about no compulsion in religion. Show me where the Quran or the Hadith says they have been abrogated. When you tell me, oh, a scholar just said that, that is appealing to authority. You can define it whatever way you want, and that is not the Islamic principle of doing something. And all Muslims even know this. I don't want to sound mean, but they would laugh at such an argument. This is basics. So you're committing a fundamental flaw in your argument. Now, furthermore, when the Prophet Muhammad went to Mecca, and this is the biggest rebuttal to you, when the Prophet Muhammad conquered Mecca, what did he do? Did he force all the pagans to convert to Islam? On the contrary, he granted them protection, and the pagans were shocked. They couldn't believe it. They used to oppress the Muslims. They used to torture the Muslims. They forced the Prophet Muhammad out of Mecca, and he returns back, and he lets them go. And this is why many of them converted to Islam, because of this great example. So that is the biggest rebuttal to that argument that everything supposedly changed. Furthermore, when the Prophet Muhammad went to Medina, and you never addressed this as well, when the Prophet Muhammad went to Medina, they made a constitution with the Jews, which granted religious freedom for both the Muslims and the Jews, and this was in the context of Medina. And again, I'm going to bring up a point which I demand an answer to. On apostasy, I quoted you a narration. This is from Sahih Bukhari. A man came to the Prophet Muhammad and pledged allegiance to Islam. The next day, he came back to the Prophet Muhammad. He took that pledge back and he left Islam, and the Prophet did not kill him. What do you have to say about that? Oh, a scholar said so and so? That doesn't count as evidence. I'm providing you evidence which refutes your point. And I believe those are mainly your points. Now, what is my definition of human rights? I'm being consistent, and I'm